Welcome to the deep dive.
Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're diving into the incredibly complex and fast-moving geopolitical currents in East and Southeast Asia. The big question we're trying to get our heads around is this. Is the region really leaning more towards China? And what does that actually mean for global dynamics, and especially for countries like South Korea with its famous strategic ambiguity?
It's fascinating, isn't it? And what's great is the sheer range of sources we've got lined up for this deep dive. We're talking top-tier geopolitical analysis, economic reports, breaking news. We've pulled stuff from War on the Rocks, Foreign Affairs, South China Morning Post, Asia Times, The National Interest, The Korea Herald, Taipei Times, really reputable outlets.
So a real mix of perspectives. Exactly. And the goal here is to pull out those, nuggets of knowledge, the key insights from all these different viewpoints, so that you, listening, can feel genuinely well-informed on what's happening. It's critical stuff, all interconnected. Our mission today, really, is to distill these complicated stories, cut through some of the noise, and give you a clear, comprehensive picture of the top news and these big strategic shifts happening right now across the region.
Okay, let's get started. And as we dig in, what jumps out right away is this point about where the U.S. is actually focusing its attention and, importantly, its resources. You hear so much about an Asia-first idea, but the reality on the ground, well, it might surprise you.
It really might.
Go
Look
ahead.
at the current landscape. The U.S. is clearly deepening its involvement in the Israeli-Iranian conflict. That takes up a huge amount of military and diplomatic energy. We're seeing very visible deployments, carrier strike groups, those advanced F-35 squadrons, really positioning themselves right there in the Middle East.
These aren't just symbolic moves, then.
Not at all. War on the Rocks makes a great point, that these deployments, they send powerful signals globally, often much clearer than, some abstract policy paper.
Yeah.
And think about those U.S. strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities back on June 21st. Well, a major escalation. It basically made the U.S. a direct party to that conflict.
Right.
And all this is happening while the war in Ukraine is still demanding massive amounts of U.S. political capital, economic aid, military support. It creates this really complex, arguably quite stretched set of global commitments for Washington.
It's a stretch thin. And it sounds like China isn't just watching this happen from the sidelines. Our sources suggest they're actively, maybe even quite cleverly, taking advantage of it.
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm.
If you connect the dots, Beijing seems to be systematically using America's focus on these Middle East quagmires, as War on the Rocks puts it, turning each crisis into a kind of strategic windfall. China isn't passive here. It actively uses what it portrays as U.S. missteps or over-interventions to push this narrative. The narrative being that U.S. leadership is, hypocritical, destabilizing, and declining.
And that narrative finds an audience.
It seems to gain traction, yeah. Especially when the U.S. gets involved in ways that, frankly, come with reputational costs on the world stage. The Red Sea crisis is a perfect example. While the U.S. and U.K. were busy conducting pretty costly military ops to keep shipping lanes open, what was China doing? Quietly cutting deals with the Houthis to make sure their ships got safe passage?
That's quite pragmatic.
Extremely pragmatic and self-serving. And it's worth remembering, China had previously sold arms and dual-use components to the Houthis. That probably helped grease the wheels for those deals. So effectively, China got to free ride on the security provided mainly by the U.S. Navy, keeping its own economic interests safe without spending its own resources or risking a direct fight.
Benefiting from the security without paying the price or taking the risk, that's a significant strategic edge, isn't it? What does that mean long-term for U.S. influence there?
It's a huge advantage. Look, China is the Middle East's biggest oil customer. Over half its energy comes from that region. So by letting the U.S. handle the security headaches, Beijing avoids a direct clash with a major power and keeps its vital oil flowing. And the numbers really drive this home. In March 2025, China imported a staggering 8.07 million metric tons of crude oil just from Iran. That's like 1.91 million barrels a day.
Wow. Despite sanctions.
Exactly. And they didn't do it through normal channels. They used all sorts of sanction busting tactics, ship-to-ship transfers out at sea, false labeling on the cargo, using third countries like Malaysia as pass-through points to hide the origin. It really shows how assertive Beijing is willing to be to challenge the existing system and, frankly, bypass global rules to keep its economy running.
But there's still a risk, right? Like the Strait of Hormuz.
Oh, absolutely. A disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, that choke point for both Iranian and Saudi oil, would be potentially a catastrophic blow to China's energy security. Sure, they have a national petroleum reserve, maybe about 90 days worth of imports. but a long disruption. That would cause immense economic pain. And while all this is happening, Beijing is also busy shaping the information war, you could say, trying to frame things to its advantage and undermine trust in U.S. leadership.
So, with all this constant pull towards crises elsewhere, what happens to that stated American Asia First idea? It's been talked about for years across different administrations. It feels like the Middle East keeps pulling focus.
It's a familiar story, unfortunately. Our sources directly question if the current Trump administration is truly sticking to an Asia-first strategy. They point to significant backsliding on prioritizing the Indo-Pacific, precisely because of this deepening Middle East involvement. And it's not just talk. It's apparently backed up by concrete things. Cuts to foreign aid offices, big reductions in U.S. information programs overseas, even key China experts leaving or being downsized at the National Security Council.
So, it suggests a real shift in priorities, institutionally.
It does. And look, this isn't entirely new. Even back with Obama's pivot to Asia in 2012, the plan to shift resources to Asia and pull back from the Middle East got, well, derailed almost immediately. You had new terrorist groups popping up, the Syrian civil war exploded, and then more recently the war in Ukraine. It just highlights this persistent problem for Washington. How do you really focus on one region when global crises keep demanding attention everywhere else?
And allies in Asia must be watching this very closely.
They absolutely are. This perception of U.S. overextension or distraction has real immediate effects on how allies in the Indo-Pacific make their own plans. For instance, sources directly connect Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba Shigeru's decision to skip the NATO summit and push back those important 2+2 talks with Secretary of State Rubio and Secretary of Defense Hegseth. They connected to the Trump administration's kind of mixed messages on Japan's defense spending and the escalation with Iran. Allies aren't just passively observing, they're actively changing their own diplomatic schedules and strategic thinking based on what they see coming out of Washington.
Okay, so from that global picture, let's zoom in now. Let's turn our focus to a really key player in Northeast Asia, South Korea. Their way of handling this geopolitical balancing act is fascinating, often misunderstood, and really exemplifies this idea of strategic ambiguity.
Right, and it brings up that critical question. How does a country like South Korea do it? They have this bedrock security alliance with the U.S., but at the same time, they have this undeniable deep economic dependence on China. It's a real tightrope. South Korea's new president, Lee Jae-myung from the Democratic Party, he's expected to take a path that's much more open to talking with both China and North Korea.
Which is a shift from the previous administration.
A very noticeable shift, yes. Away from the more confrontational approach of the now disgraced Yoon Suk-yeol government. It really shows South Korea's political pendulum swinging back towards, let's say, reassurance and diplomatic flexibility. The focus shifts back to trying to lower tensions on the Korean peninsula through talking, through engagement, and managing the uncertainty in East Asia with pragmatism, not just strict alignment. It's definitely a return to a more cautious balancing act.
And it's not just about the leader changing, is it? It sounds like public opinion in South Korea is a massive factor, maybe even the deciding factor in how their foreign policy gets shaped. It is a democracy, after all.
Hugely important. In a democracy like South Korea, the government has to listen to the public. And polling data from the East Asia Institute, for example, consistently shows something interesting. While South Koreans do have concerns about China, they generally don't see China as the kind of existential threat that many in the U.S. policy world perceive it to be. That's a really key difference and often a source of friction between Washington and Seoul.
So what are they worried about then?
Well, a big majority, something like 67% of Koreans, are much more worried about getting dragged into the escalating U.S.-China fight, becoming, collateral damage in some big power struggle that's not really theirs. Only about 12% say China's military power is why they have negative views. What really sticks in people's minds is China's coercive retaliation about the THAAD radar batteries.
The economic backlash after they deployed that U.S. missile defense system.
Exactly. South Korea faced this severe economic punishment, boycotts of their goods, tourism dried up, even cultural exports were hit hard, all because they deployed THAAD in 2016. That whole episode left a deep scar. It showed everyone how willing China is to use its huge economic muscle as a political weapon if it feels provoked. So, understandably, there's this strong pragmatic feeling among Koreans of wanting to avoid getting caught in that kind of crossfire again.
Which brings us right back to this famous South Korean strategic ambiguity. How does that actually play out in their alliances and their regional relationships, trying to navigate between these two giants?
It's a very distinctive position. This strategic ambiguity is not just being indecisive. It's a calculated diplomatic strategy. Seoul deliberately tries to avoid locking itself completely into either the U.S. or the China camp. The goal is to keep those vital economic links with China going strong, while at the same time holding on to the essential security guarantee from the United States. It's about keeping options open, maintaining flexibility in a world that's changing incredibly fast, even if sometimes it frustrates both Washington and Beijing, who might prefer a clearer stance.
So how do they signal that balance?
Well, look at their official documents. Yes, Seoul uses the term Indo-Pacific, and yes, they've stressed cooperation with the U.S. and Japan. Think of the Camp David Agreement. But crucially, South Korea's own 2022 Indo-Pacific strategy also specifically talks about harmoniously developing ROK-US-Japan cooperation and ROK-Japan-China cooperation. It explicitly lays out this dual-track approach. Balancing is baked into the strategy.
And how does China see this ambiguity?
Our sources suggest China has long seen South Korea as potentially the weakest link in any solid U.S.-led front aimed at containing China. Why? Precisely because South Korea isn't part of those more exclusive, more overtly anti-China security groups like the Quad or AUKUS. Beijing views Seoul's flexibility as a strategic opening, something it can potentially exploit. And adding to that perception, the new South Korean president deciding to skip the NATO summit. Some U.S. experts call that a strategic mistake, which just highlights how differently Seoul's actions are viewed from Washington versus perhaps Beijing or even Seoul itself.
But the economic reality remains.
Absolutely. For South Korea, despite its own global success, China is still just an incredibly critical partner for trade, for investment, for innovation. Those pragmatic economic facts always weigh heavily on Seoul's foreign policy decisions. It's this constant high-stakes juggling act between security needs and economic well-being.
Okay, so from Northeast Asia's delicate balancing, let's shift our gaze further south. To Southeast Asia, a region grappling with its own equally intricate geopolitical dance. This is a place that, for decades, has really tried hard not to pick sides between the major powers. Maintaining that neutrality must be getting tougher, though.
It really must be. What's so striking is how this region, Southeast Asia, with almost 700 million people, is just smack dab in the middle of this intensifying U.S.-China rivalry. For years, the mantra from leaders there has been, we don't have to choose. The preference was always to be friends to all, and honestly, the region thrived during that period of growing economic ties with everyone. Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong put it perfectly back in 2018. He said, circumstances may come where ASEAN may have to choose one or the other. I hope it does not happen soon. That trust perfectly captures the region's collective hope and maybe anxiety about delaying what feels like an increasingly inevitable and difficult choice.
But even with that hope, our sources are saying there's a real measurable shift underway, almost like a slow, quiet, but undeniable drift.
That's exactly right. And to actually try and measure this, our sources point to something called the Anatomy of Choice Alignment Index. It's a pretty sophisticated piece of analysis using 30 years of data. It looks at alignment across 5 key areas: politics and diplomacy, military and security, economics, cultural affinity, and sort of symbolic signaling. And what this index reveals is pretty stark. Despite that official line of not wanting to choose, many of these countries have, quote, gradually but discernibly shifted away from the United States and toward China. The overall trend, the direction of travel, when you look at the data in aggregate, is clearly towards China.
Wow. A gradual but discernible shift towards China. Can you break down some of the specifics from that index? Who's leaning where?
Sure. The index gives us a detailed picture. Over the last 30 years, 4 countries have managed to stay roughly in the middle. Indonesia scoring 49, Malaysia 47, Singapore 48, and Thailand 45. They're seen as the successful hedgers, basically managing to balance influences pretty well, staying in that 45-55 range. Then you have the Philippines scoring 60, clearly aligned with the U.S., mainly because of their formal alliance treaty. Although, interestingly, even the Philippines has edged slightly closer to China recently, dropping from 62 to 58 in the 2010-24 period. So even there, subtle shifts are happening.
And on the other side, leaning towards China.
Yes, several countries fall into that category, according to the index. Myanmar scores 24, Laos 29, Cambodia 38, Vietnam 43, and Brunei 44. Their lower scores indicate they are increasingly and quite solidly aligned with China.
And what about the changes over time? That seems like where this drift really shows up.
Exactly. That's where it gets really compelling. If you compare the period 1995-2009 with the more recent 2010-2024 period, you see some major moves. Indonesia, for example, went from being slightly in the U.S. camp, score 56, to being slightly in China's camp, score 43. That's a huge shift for such a large, strategically vital country. Thailand also moved from being a clear hedger, 49, to leaning towards China, 41. Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, they just continue drifting deeper into China's orbit. But here's the fascinating outlier: Vietnam. It's the only country in the index that actually moves slightly away from China and a bit towards the U.S., going from 41 to 45. It's not a massive jump, though. It suggests Vietnam is moving more towards that middle hedging zone rather than fully embracing the U.S., probably due to its own complicated history and lingering suspicions about China.
Okay, so what's actually driving this overall drift towards China across Southeast Asia? It can't just be one thing, right? It must be a mix of factors.
Absolutely. It's a complex mix. Domestic politics is definitely one driver. Cambodia is a really clear case study. After the 1997 coup that brought Hun Sen to power, relations with the U.S. totally soured. The U.S. cut aid, imposed an arms embargo, basically isolated them. What did China do? Stepped right in, offered huge amounts of investment, political backing, military help, and crucially, without all the criticism about human rights or democracy that usually comes with Western aid. So, naturally, Cambodia tilted strongly towards Beijing. You see variations of this elsewhere. Many non-democratic regimes in ASEAN feel China is a better bet for supporting their economic goals and, frankly, their political survival without asking uncomfortable questions.
And the economics must be a massive pull factor, too, especially in a region focused on development.
Oh, enormous. Economic gravity is a powerful force. China is now the biggest trading partner for ASEAN as a whole. That's huge. And while the U.S. still leads in overall foreign direct investment, FDI, China is catching up fast in many countries, largely through its Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. BRI funds these massive infrastructure projects, railways, ports, power plants all across the region. It provides development money that many Western countries just aren't offering at the same scale or speed anymore.
You mentioned Indonesia shifted significantly. What happened there?
Yeah, Indonesia is a great example of shifting perceptions. Historically, during the Cold War, the Indonesian military was very wary of China. Ideological differences, historical baggage, but in recent decades, new political leaders and powerful business groups have really pushed this pro-growth agenda, and they increasingly see China not as an ideological threat, but as an essential source of economic opportunity and investment. You see concrete signs of this. The newly elected president, Prabowo Subianto, where was his first foreign trip in 2024, China. Then Chinese Premier Li Qiang visited Indonesia in May 2025. Lots of high-level engagement. Indonesia's even done military exercises with China. And importantly, they've largely stopped the old habit of blaming ethnic Chinese Indonesians for economic problems, which signals a much more pragmatic, integrated approach now.
And then there's the U.S. side of the equation. Perceptions about American reliability, especially with Trump's potential return, must be playing a role.
A critical role. That prospect of Trump returning has caused real anxiety across Southeast Asia about whether the U.S. will stick to its long-term military and economic commitments in the region. Singapore's Prime Minister Lawrence Wong said something very telling in April 2025. He basically said the new normal is an America that's stepping back from being the world's policeman and guarantor of order. That reflects a deep worry about U.S. reliability.
Wow.
And add to that what Singapore's former defense minister, Ng Hen, observed even earlier, that the U.S. image has shifted from liberator to great disruptor to a landlord seeking rent. That's really blunt assessment, suggesting a view of America as more transactional and less dependable than before.
And specific U.S. policies are having an impact, too.
Definitely. Look at the anger in Muslim-majority countries like Indonesia and Malaysia over Washington's strong backing of Israel's Gaza campaign. That led governments there to publicly distance themselves from the U.S. It makes it harder for the U.S. to talk about a rules-based international order when its actions are seen as contradicting it in other parts of the world. And this feeds into polling. That 2024 IZ's USAV Ishak Institute survey we mentioned, it found 50% of regional experts thought ASEAN should pick China over the U.S. Just a year before, 61% had favored the U.S. That's a massive swing in sentiment in just 1 year.
A huge swing.
And then there's the looming threat of potential reciprocal tariffs from a second Trump administration. If key ASEAN economies like Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam face new tariffs, losing access to U.S. investment and markets, well, that would inevitably push them even further towards China's economic embrace.
And finally, just the basic fact of geography has to play a part, especially for countries right next door to China.
It's fundamental. Countries sharing a land border with China, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, they just naturally feel Beijing's gravitational pull much more intensely. Proximity creates dependencies. It makes China's influence incredibly hard to ignore. Now, history can temper that pull, like we see with Vietnam's caution towards China. Vietnam, remember, only agreed to a comprehensive strategic partnership with the U.S. in 2023, a full 15 years after they'd established one with China. That shows careful balancing. But look at Laos. It's become almost totally dependent on Chinese money for its big hydroelectric dam projects. Chinese loans make up something like half of Laos's entire foreign debt. Geography translates directly into economic leverage for Beijing.
But even with all this movement towards China, driven by economics, politics, geography, you mentioned there's still a gap when it comes to trust.
That's a really crucial point, and something Beijing knows it needs to work on. Influence isn't the same as trust. Polls consistently show regional elites see China as the most influential power, economically and strategically, way ahead of the U.S. No question about influence. But when that same 2024 IZEA's poll asked about trust, elites ranked Japan first. The U.S. came second, the European Union third, China, a distant fourth.
Wow, distant fourth.
Yeah. It suggests that while many countries might be aligning more with China out of pragmatism or perceived necessity, Beijing still has a long way to go to really earn the deep underlying trust of its neighbors. Concerns about its assertiveness, especially in the South China Sea, and its political system, those things create a lingering trust deficit.
Okay, let's pivot slightly now. Let's take a snapshot look at China itself, some internal things, its relationships with immediate neighbors like Taiwan and North Korea, and its broader military activities in the region. It seems like a very busy, multi-pronged approach.
It really is. Starting with China's own actions, recent news highlighted what they call their largest military and civilian rescue drill in the South China Sea. Notably, it was held off Woody Island in the Paracels, which are contested. That sends a signal about both their claims and their growing ability to operate effectively in those waters. Domestically, we've seen signs of ongoing political tightening. A Navy chief of staff, a nuclear scientist, both recently kicked out of the top legislature. That suggests efforts to maintain strict party control, especially in sensitive areas.
Any signs of easing tensions, maybe on the trade front?
Well, there was one interesting development. China and the U.S. did reach some kind of agreement on export controls after talks in London. That might suggest a little bit of de-escalation in specific managed areas of trade, but the bigger economic picture still looks challenging. Chinese industrial profits actually fell 9% in May. That's blamed on weak domestic demand and, yes, the ongoing friction from the U.S. trade dispute, so still facing headwinds there.
And how is Taiwan coping with all this? The pressure on them seems relentless.
It truly is immense and constant. Taiwan's president, William Lai, recently declared July as National Unity Month. That's a very deliberate move to rally the Taiwanese people, showcase their determination in the face of these high military tensions and fears of war, as the Taipei Times put it. You also had Taiwan's Mainland Affairs Council strongly condemning the Chinese Communist Party after Czech officials confirmed Chinese agents had actually surveilled Taiwan's Vice President Xiao Bi-kim during her visit to Prague. It highlights the sort of pervasive intelligence threat they face.
So how are they preparing?
Actively. They're emphasizing their gray zone response tactics, ways to counter Chinese pressure that falls short of actual war. And they're highlighting the deployment of those new HIMARS rocket systems in their big Han Kuang military drills. HIMARS are key for asymmetric defense against a larger force. They're even planning to launch their first sovereign satellite this year. That signals a real push for more strategic independence, especially in critical areas like space communications and surveillance.
And Hong Kong. 5 years on from the national security law, what's the situation there? How's that unique status holding up?
Well, the political space continues to shrink dramatically. The League of Social Democrats, a well-known opposition group, just announced it was disbanding after 19 years. That's a pretty stark indicator. Now, some sources say there are signs that the city has bounced back economically in some ways since the law came in, life resuming a kind of normalcy. But those same sources also say the ongoing U.S.-China tensions mean storm clouds are lingering. Hong Kong's future as a global hub, its whole one country, two systems model, it's still under intense pressure and scrutiny.
Okay, this raises a really important question about the China-North Korea-Russia relationship. We hear talk of a new axis forming. Is that accurate or is it more complicated?
Much more complicated, according to our sources. Yes, Chinese and North Korean soldiers marched in Moscow's Victory Day parade in May 2025. And yes, China keeps talking about its no-limits partnership with Russia. But when it comes to North Korea specifically, the relationship is described as being marked by deep ambivalence. China is still absolutely essential for keeping the North Korean regime afloat, especially economically. It's a lifeline. But Beijing is also clearly cautious. It seems to swing between trying to rein in Pyongyang's destabilizing actions, like missile tests, and the strategic need to keep North Korea stable as a buffer state on its border.
And North Korea getting closer to Russia worries China.
It seems to, yes. Beijing is reportedly watching this growing closeness between Pyongyang and Moscow with real concern. especially if it involves military tech cooperation. The idea that Russia might transfer sensitive missile or maybe even nuclear technology to North Korea without Beijing's okay, that definitely fuels mistrust and makes China's regional calculations even harder. So despite the appearances sometimes, this isn't really a formal coordinated axis like in World War II. Beijing, Moscow, Pyongyang, each is still primarily focused on its own strategic interests, and those interests don't always perfectly align. China itself pushes back hard against any narrative of a rigid coalition, especially one that might include Iran. They see that as an attempt to isolate them.
And beyond its immediate neighbors, China's influence is really spreading in South Asia, too, right into what India traditionally sees as its backyard. That seems like a major strategic shift.
It's a profound shift, absolutely. China is making significant inroads across South Asia, changing the power dynamics there quite fundamentally. Pakistan, of course, has long been one of China's closest partners and India's main rival. Pakistan's military has benefited hugely from Chinese hardware, advanced missiles, defense systems, modern fighter jets, which directly impacts the military balance with India. But now we're seeing shifts even in countries that were traditionally closer to India. Look at Bangladesh. After its pro-India government was ousted, the interim government turned to China for billions in aid and infrastructure funding, especially with anti-India sentiment rising among some parts of the population.
And the Maldives and Sri Lanka, too.
Yes. In the Maldives, President Muzu won election on an explicit India out platform. He's openly embraced much closer ties with China, which is stepping in with much-needed development funding. And in Sri Lanka, there's a new leftist alliance that's described as clearly favoring Beijing. Its leader has publicly praised China's economic model and held pro-China rallies. Taken together, these moves really show an erosion of India's traditional dominance in its own neighborhood. It's a clear strategic gain for China.
Okay, finally, let's touch on China's direct military activities and these so-called gray zone tactics. It sounds like they're really stepping up their game, both in terms of capability and how they use their forces to achieve goals without necessarily starting a full-blown war.
That's exactly right. From Beijing's perspective, U.S. extended deterrence, the American promise to defend its allies, isn't seen as defensive. It's seen as part of an effort to contain China's rise. So China has really accelerated its efforts to undermine that deterrence. They use a mix of tools, sharp rhetoric, economic carrots and sticks, and, increasingly, more assertive and confrontational military actions. They've significantly increased their use of gray zone tactics, especially at sea and in cyberspace. These are actions designed to stay below the threshold of armed conflict, but still achieve strategic effects.
Like using their Coast Guard.
Precisely. Deploying the China Coast Guard, which is huge, and their maritime militia, basically armed fishing boats, to harass the vessels of U.S. allies in disputed waters. We see this constantly with the Philippines and the South China Sea trying to block their resupply missions. It's about gradually asserting control and wearing down resistance without firing a shot. China's also massively increased the scale and complexity of its military exercises, particularly around Taiwan. Admiral Samuel Paparo, head of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, has bluntly called these drills rehearsals for attacking U.S. allies, like simulating an invasion of Taiwan. Think of exercises like Joint Sword 2024A and B. These are large-scale simulations of blockades and landings.
And the long-term goal?
The stated goal is building world-class military forces by 2049. They're pouring incredible resources into conventional weapons, nuclear weapons, and boosting their capabilities in cyberspace, space, and electronic warfare. The intention behind all this seems twofold. First, make the U.S. think twice, really hesitate before intervening in a crisis like over Taiwan. And second, sow doubt in the minds of U.S. allies like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, about whether Washington would actually come to their defense if the crunch came. It's about undermining those security guarantees.
Okay, so let's try and pull all these threads together. As we wrap up, what we've really seen today is this incredibly complex picture, a mosaic, really, of shifting alliances, powerful economic forces, and intricate strategic moves all playing out across East and Southeast Asia.
Absolutely. And if you connect it all back to that bigger picture we started with, it seems pretty clear that the U.S. being drawn into conflicts and commitments elsewhere, particularly the Middle East, genuinely creates a strategic opening for China, an opening it's actively using to increase its influence right across Asia. And this impacts everything: the structure of alliances, defense planning, trade patterns, the fundamental geopolitical alignment of entire nations. And while, yes, countries in the region are desperately trying to hedge their bets with that strategic ambiguity we talked about, the data does suggest this observable continental drift towards China.
Driven by that complex mix of factors.
Exactly. Domestic politics, Economic needs and opportunities, shifting perceptions about who's a reliable partner, and just the basic, undeniable reality of geography, it's all pushing in that direction, even if trust hasn't fully followed yet. So hopefully this deep dive leaves you, our listener, with a much richer, more comprehensive, and well-informed understanding of these really critical shifts happening in the region, getting you well beyond just the daily headlines to see the deeper currents at play.